Chapter 1. A Reluctant Warrior's Journey. Alvin York was an unlikely hero. Born in the Tennessee Hills in 1887, he grew up in a humble log cabin as one of 11 children. As a young man, he was known not for discipline or soldiering, but for his superb marksmanship and his deep religious faith. York spent his youth hunting wild turkey and deer in the mountains, becoming a crack shot with a rifle long before he ever wore a uniform. Yet he was also a pacifist at heart. A devout Christian who initially believed that killing, even in war, was wrong. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, and Alvin York was drafted into the army, he agonized over this call to arms. He even tried to declare himself a conscientious objector, citing the biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." But his request was denied, and duty bound him to serve. In training camp at Camp Gordon, Georgia, Alvin York continued to wrestle with his conscience. He was a quiet, red-haired country boy suddenly thrust into the life of a soldier. His superior officers saw potential in him. York was a crack shot, able to hit targets with uncanny accuracy, thanks to years of hunting in the backwoods. But York still questioned whether God wanted him to go to war. One army major took the time to counsel York, pointing out scriptures about fighting evil and protecting the innocent. After much soul-searching and prayer, York reluctantly concluded that service was his duty, so long as he aimed to save lives and only kill when absolutely necessary. With a heavy heart but steely resolve, he boarded a ship to France in 1918 to do his part. Arriving on the Western Front, Corporal Alvin York found himself in a hellscape far removed from his peaceful valley home. By the autumn of 1918, World War I had devolved into brutal trench warfare. Millions had already perished in battles across blasted fields and dark forests. York was assigned to the U.S. 82nd Infantry Division, part of the Allied forces pushing against the Germans in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American operation of the war. The goal was to break through the German lines along the Meuse River and Argonne Forest, a dense woodland turned fortress by entrenched machine guns and artillery. The once serene Argonne was now shattered by shellfire. Trees splintered, earth torn into craters, the air heavy with fog and the stench of cordite. It was into this cauldron that Alvin York and his comrades marched in early October 1918, knowing the German army was making its last, desperate stand. Chapter 2. Into the Argonne. Before dawn on October 8, 1918, the 328th Infantry Regiment, York's unit, advanced into the Argonne Forest, near the French village of Châtel-Chéhéry. Their objective was a strategic German position on Hill 223, which guarded a vital Decauville railroad running through the valley. The hill was bristling with German machine gun nests that had already pinned down the American attack in deadly fashion. In fact, an initial frontal assault up the slope had been repulsed with horrific losses, as German machine guns scythed through the ranks of U.S. troops climbing the hill. Determined to silence those guns, the American commanders decided on a risky flanking maneuver. A small detachment of soldiers would slip around the hill through the thick woods, get behind the German machine gunners, and take them out from the rear. It was a dangerous mission, essentially infiltrating enemy lines, but it offered the only hope of neutralizing the deadly fire. Alvin York was one of the 17 men chosen for this daring patrol. Led by a sergeant named Bernard Early, the group included several experienced non-commissioned officers and privates, doughboys who, like York, were grimly determined to end the carnage on the hillside. In the misty morning light, they crept through ravines and clambered over ridges, using the Argonne's dense undergrowth as cover. The terrain was confusing, a maze of trees and ravines, and the Americans' map was written in French, adding to the challenge. Unbeknownst to the Germans above, this band of U.S. soldiers managed to slip behind the German lines. Moving cautiously, they came upon a German camp on the backside of the hill, a field headquarters and supply area where enemy troops were just beginning their day. The Americans had the element of surprise. Bursting from the brush with rifles ready, they confronted a group of astonished German soldiers, some of whom were preparing breakfast and had stacked their rifles nearby. Sergeant Early's men yelled for the Germans to surrender. Caught off guard, a large number of enemy troops dropped their weapons and raised their hands. In a matter of moments, The patrol captured a sizable group of German soldiers. Imagine the scene. One minute, the Germans in the rear thought they were safe, and the next, they were staring at American rifles emerging from the trees. York and his comrades could hardly believe their gamble had worked so well. They had scooped up dozens of prisoners without a fight. For a brief moment, it seemed the worst was over for York's patrol. They had taken the machine gun crews by surprise from behind. But the jubilation was short-lived. As the Americans were corralling their prisoners, shouting orders in English at confused Germans, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted from the wooded slope above. The captured German soldiers had begun yelling at their comrades on the ridge, warning them of the Americans in their rear. In response, other German machine gunners on the heights swiftly swung their weapons around and opened fire on York's detachment from above. In an instant, the hunters became the hunted. Bullets tore through the clearing where the Americans stood, cutting down men with ruthless efficiency. The ambush was devastating. York later described how those German machine guns spit fire and cut down the undergrowth all around me, something awful. He watched in horror as his fellow soldiers were mowed down almost where they stood. When the wild burst of firing subsided, Alvin York slowly lifted his head and looked around. The scene was gut-wrenching. Of the 17 men in the patrol, several now lay crumpled on the ground, either dead or badly wounded. In that first vicious fusillade, 6 Americans had been killed outright and 3 more wounded. Among the fallen was York's close friend, Corporal Murray Savage, who only moments before had been standing at York's side. York's heart clenched, seeing Savage and others sprawled motionless on the forest floor. Their mission to outflank the enemy had succeeded, but now they were trapped behind enemy lines under deadly fire. With over a dozen German prisoners to guard and only a handful of US soldiers left standing. As the German guns above continued to hammer away, the surviving Americans dove for any cover they could find. Sergeant Early was no more. He had been struck down along with the other sergeants. In fact, every leader in the patrol was either dead or incapacitated. In the span of a minute, Corporal Alvin York suddenly found himself the highest-ranking man left in the squad. The responsibility for survival fell squarely on his shoulders. Bullets whipped through the trees, and bark and dirt sprayed around the Americans as they hugged the ground. The German machine gunners had perfect high-ground positions and were raking the area mercilessly. If York's men stayed pinned down in that spot, they would surely be killed one by one, and the Germans might even flee. Taking a quick head count, York saw that besides himself, only 7 other Americans remained able to fight, and those men were busy guarding the prisoners and keeping their heads down from the gunfire. Someone had to stop those machine guns, and that someone, York knew in a flash of cold clarity, was him. In that critical moment, Alvin York's internal doubts and pacifist reservations fell away. His comrades were dying, and he was determined to save the rest. York tapped a few nearby soldiers and motioned for them to keep the prisoners under guard and flat on the ground. "Hold them here," he shouted over the din of gunfire, referring to the captured Germans. York likely realized that if the prisoners tried to run or rearm themselves, the Americans would be finished. The other surviving doughboys nodded and leveled their rifles at the frightened German captives. With that, Corporal York clenched his jaw, gripped his M1917 Enfield rifle, and prepared to do the unthinkable. He would take on the German machine guns alone. Chapter 3. Hunting the Ghost. York quietly moved away from the group, rifle in hand, and slipped into a firing position where he had a better line of sight on the German machine gun nests above. He found a slight depression in the ground and propped himself behind a small rise, giving him some cover. From his vantage point, he could see the muzzle flashes of multiple German machine guns pouring fire down the slope. There were at least a couple of enemy gun pits still active, maybe more, their exact positions hidden among the trees and brush on the ridge. York was one lone soldier, lying prone in the mud, facing an entire hillside of well-armed enemy troops. It was a seemingly impossible task, but Alvin York was not thinking of the odds. He was thinking of survival. He pressed his cheek to his rifle stock, steadied his breathing, and began to return fire with deadly intent. High above, the German machine gunners were focused on the spot where York's patrol had been caught. They had no idea that one determined American was now picking them off from below. As York peered through his rifle sights, he saw a German helmet pop up over a sandbag bunker, trying to spot targets. York's finger tightened on the trigger. Crack, crack! His rifle spoke, and the German gunner toppled out of sight. A second later, another enemy soldier rose to man the machine gun. Crack! York's aim was true again. The second gunner fell. Each time a German crew member tried to swivel his machine gun or peer over the parapet, York's eagle eye was watching. Shot after shot, each timed with calm precision, York began silencing the guns one man at a time. The Germans soon realized they were under fire from an unseen marksman to their rear. Confusion spread through the enemy line. How many Americans were back there? From the accuracy of York's fire, the Germans might have assumed they were facing a whole squad of crack sharpshooters. In reality, it was a single Tennessee backwoodsman expertly, turkey shooting, any target that showed itself. York's upbringing, hunting wild game, had taught him to shoot quickly and without hesitation. He later explained that the trick was to take out the furthest enemy first and work forward, so the ones in front wouldn't notice their comrades dropping behind them. Now in the Argonne, that hunting wisdom came to him instinctively. German gunners yelled in alarm as, one by one, their numbers fell to an almost invisible foe. To the rattled German soldiers, it was as if a ghost was haunting the forest, a deadly spectre who struck without being seen. They were, quite literally, hunting a ghost that darted among the trees and refused to die. York kept himself low and in shadow, changing position slightly after each shot to avoid giving the enemy a clear target. Bullets chewed up the dirt around him and shredded the foliage. The German machine guns were now desperately trying to zero in on this lone rifleman who was decimating their ranks. But Alvin York kept his cool. He did not flinch or retreat. In those adrenaline-charged moments, decades of frontier hunting merged with his fierce determination to protect his boys lying behind him. Each time a German head or even a rifle barrel was foolish enough to be exposed, York was ready. His rifle cracked, and another enemy would slump away. He was like a one-man army, systematically taking apart the German strongpoint. Furious and alarmed, the German commanders decided to counterattack this stubborn American. Suddenly, a group of enemy soldiers scrambled out of a trench farther up the ridge and began charging down towards York. 5 men, then 6, bayonets fixed on their rifles, rushed straight at the lone U.S. corporal, determined to overwhelm him in close combat. They had roughly 25 yards to cross through the broken brush. York saw the glint of steel on their bayonet tips and understood immediately. If those men reached him, he'd be in a desperate hand-to-hand fight or dead. He had only a split second to react. Staying prone, York quickly dropped his rifle. It had no time to be reloaded, and snatched out his M1911 Colt .45 pistol from its holster. Rather than panic, he knelt and took aim with the calm of a practiced shootist. As the first German stormed toward him, York did something unexpected. He aimed for the man at the back of the charging pack first. He squeezed the trigger, and the rearmost attacker crumpled to the ground. The other Germans kept coming, unaware their comrade had fallen behind them. York then shot the next man in line, and the next, working back to front in rapid succession. The German soldiers never realized what was happening. The ones in front did not see their comrades behind them being cut down, and so they continued the charge forward. In a matter of seconds, York teched off, as he would say, all 6 charging soldiers with 6 precise pistol shots. The final German in front staggered and fell only a few paces from York, pistol bullets having stopped them all. It was an astonishing display of marksmanship, composure, and tactical cunning under immense pressure. York himself later likened it to how he would shoot wild turkeys at home. If you take the rearmost first, the others don't scatter. In the Argonne Forest that day, that hunting tactic saved his life. With the bayonet charge neutralized, York turned his attention back to the remaining machine guns. By now, piles of German dead and wounded lay around the gun pits on the ridge. Those who were still alive were in a state of shock and fear. Here was a single American, out in the open, who simply would not be hit and would not stop shooting. York called out again and again for the enemy to surrender. He shouted in English for them to throw down their guns, not wanting to kill any more than necessary. The Germans couldn't make out his words amid the gunfire and chaos, but they could certainly sense his intent. One German officer, a First Lieutenant Paul-Jürgen Vollmer, had emptied an entire pistol magazine firing at York during the melee, and astonishingly, every one of his bullets missed its mark. Realizing that most of his men were dead or incapacitated, and that he was facing certain death himself, this German officer finally decided he'd had enough. Lieutenant Vollmer stood up from his position, likely waving a white cloth or simply his empty hands, and shouted something toward York. "Stop shooting!" he yelled in German. Then in broken English he called out, asking if the unseen rifleman was English. "No, not English. American," York replied from his cover. Stunned that a single American soldier had wrought so much destruction, the German officer exclaimed, "Good Lord!" According to York's recollection, the enemy officer then spoke in halting English. "If you don't shoot any more, I will make them surrender." York cautiously emerged, his pistol still in hand, and watched as Lieutenant Vollmer, effectively the German commander on that hill, gave orders for his remaining troops to cease fire. York had his gun trained on the officer and warned him that if the Germans did anything tricky, he would shoot him next. But there was no trick. The surviving German soldiers were only too eager to give up by then. The muzzle flashes went dark, and an eerie silence fell over that corner of the Argonne Forest. Out of the trenches and brush, German soldiers began rising with their hands in the air. Dozens of them. What, moments before, had been a fierce firefight was now a mass surrender. Alvin York had done the impossible, single-handedly silencing the machine guns and compelling a vastly larger enemy force to lay down its arms. One by one, German infantrymen climbed down from their positions, throwing their rifles, pistols, and grenades to the ground. York quickly took charge, ordering the Germans to form up. He and the few American survivors gathered their wits and began securing the scene. York's men were astounded. They had witnessed one corporal effectively defeat an entire German unit, but there was no time to celebrate yet. They were still behind enemy lines, with scores of prisoners and wounded comrades to deal with. York knew they had to move, and fast, before any other German forces realized what was happening and intervened. York had the German lieutenant, who was actually a battalion commander, assemble his soldiers and even carry the wounded Americans. "I ain't a-going to leave any of my boys lying out here," York declared. Under York's watchful eye, captured German medics gently lifted the wounded US soldiers, including those grievously hurt in the earlier gunfire. German stretcher-bearers were organized to transport the American injured, while others helped gather the German wounded as well. York was merciful in victory. Despite all the bloodshed, he had no interest in revenge or cruelty. His aim had been to stop the killing, and now that the Germans had surrendered, he treated them humanely. With everything in order, York prepared to lead everyone, friends and former foes alike, back toward the American lines. Just then, a few remaining German soldiers from farther out, unaware of the surrender, appeared along a trail. Seeing the large group of their countrymen under guard, these stragglers were bewildered. York raised his rifle and shouted at them to drop their weapons. Faced with the scene of an American giving orders to their comrades, and thinking there must be a whole company of Yankees present, they too complied. In this way, as York's party began moving out, they gathered even more prisoners who stumbled into the net. What began as a mission by 17 men had turned into a column of enemy captives many times their number. Alvin York and the 7 Americans left standing herded the German prisoners through the forest back the way they had come. It was a surreal sight. At the head of the column was York, a mud-splattered corporal with determination in his eyes, and ahead of him marched the captured German officer Vollner. Behind them, in a long file, trudged group after group of German soldiers, 80, 90, over 100 in all, carrying their wounded and the wounded Americans. Some of the Germans helped support their former adversaries on improvised stretchers at York's direction. As they made their way toward the American lines, a few gunshots rang out in the distance. Scattered firefights still raged elsewhere in the Argonne, but York's contingent pressed on, carefully, likely waving some white cloth to signal their status as surrendering troops. At one tense moment, a pocket of German soldiers on a distant rise caught sight of the column and raised their rifles, perhaps thinking their comrades were being marched by a small American squad. York, fearless and improvisational, boldly called out through Lieutenant Vollmer, ordering those Germans to surrender as well. Amazingly, they did. By the time York was approaching the U.S. front lines again, he had gathered even more prisoners. The final tally of Germans taken was an astonishing 132 men, including 4 officers, and York had personally been the driving force behind it. Chapter 4. Aftermath and Legacy. As York and his little band of brothers escorted the column of captured Germans back into Allied territory, their fellow American soldiers could not believe their eyes. Earlier that morning, the 328th Infantry's attack had stalled with severe casualties. Now, out of the woods emerged a lone corporal and a handful of doughboys guarding what looked like an entire German company. When they realized the Germans were prisoners, a cheer went up along the American line. Doughboys rushed forward to help disarm and secure the captives. The stunned German prisoners were marched toward the rear as heroes' welcomes began for the men who had captured them. At the regimental command post, a senior American officer gaped at the spectacle of 132 enemy soldiers being delivered by York's patrol. Brigadier General Julian Lindsay, the brigade commander, looked at the scruffy corporal responsible and exclaimed in amazement, "Well, York, it looks like you've captured the whole German army." The comment broke the tension, and some laughter rippled through the ranks. Alvin York, humble as ever, shook his head and replied, "No, sir, I've only got 132 of them." It was the kind of modest, matter-of-fact statement that would characterize York in all the fame to follow. Word of York's incredible feat spread quickly through the division and up the chain of command. On the very same day, as reports were compiled, York's commanders recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. A few weeks later, once a thorough investigation had confirmed every detail of his story and confirmed that one man really had done what initially seemed impossible, the Army approved an upgrade. Alvin York would receive the Medal of Honor, America's highest award for valor. In the official citation, the government credited York with single-handedly killing over 20 enemy soldiers and capturing 132, along with silencing multiple machine gun nests. York was promptly promoted from corporal to sergeant, skipping the rank of sergeant entirely in recognition of his new status. In fact, the promotion was effective almost immediately after the battle. The once reluctant, backwards draftee had become one of the U.S. Army's most celebrated soldiers virtually overnight. For York, however, the adulation that followed was a bit overwhelming. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, just a month after his deed, York was still a corporal on paper, but a national hero in headlines. He was brought to military headquarters and congratulated personally by General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing dubbed him the greatest civilian soldier of World War I. The story of York's one-man assault was printed in newspapers worldwide, astonishing readers who could barely comprehend how a single soldier could achieve such a feat. York himself remained polite and quietly spoken through all the praise. He insisted that he had acted as part of his unit and that it was a team effort. "I'm just one of the boys," he would say. In his diary and later interviews, York was quick to credit his faith in God for protecting him. Surviving such a storm of bullets felt miraculous to him, and he believed a divine hand had guided him in the chaos. When Alvin York returned home to the United States in 1919, he initially sought to fade back into private life. A huge ticker-tape parade greeted him in New York City, and banquets were held in his honor. The quiet man from Pall Mall, Tennessee, found himself thrust into the limelight. He received not only the Medal of Honor, but also foreign accolades like the French Croix de Guerre and the Italian Croce al Merito, among others. The spotlight could have turned Alvin York into a celebrity chasing riches, but that was not his way. He turned down numerous offers that would have capitalized on his fame, including lucrative movie deals, product endorsements, and even carnival shows that wanted to exhibit him. York's heart was still back in Tennessee, with the family and community he loved. Instead of cashing in, York used his newfound influence to better the lives of others. One of Alvin York's deepest convictions after the war was that education was vital for the youth in his rural region, who often lacked opportunities. He had only a few months of formal schooling himself and knew how limiting that was. So, using donations raised in his honor and working tirelessly on his own, York founded the York Agricultural Institute, today known as the Alvin York Institute. In 1926, he poured his energy and money into this school for the underprivileged children of his home county. At times, he even mortgaged his own farm to keep the school running, paid teachers' salaries out of pocket, and personally helped build the schoolhouse. This, to York, was a legacy far more meaningful than battlefield glory, giving the next generation a chance to succeed. York married his sweetheart, Gracie Williams, soon after returning from the war, and together they settled on a farm in Pall Mall that grateful Tennessee citizens had purchased for the war hero. He tried to resume a normal life, raising a family. He would have 10 children, and occasionally giving speeches or lectures for veteran causes. For years, York avoided any attempts to dramatize his life story. He was inherently modest and felt that the true heroes were the boys who hadn't made it home. However, as time went on, the idea of a Hollywood movie about him kept resurfacing. York initially refused repeatedly. He didn't want his war experience to be romanticized or himself to be portrayed as bragging. It was only when he realized that a film could raise funds for his educational projects that he finally agreed. In 1941, just as a new world war loomed for America, Warner Brothers released Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper as Alvin York. The film depicted York's early life and his famous actions in the Argonne. It became the highest-grossing movie in the country that year, and Gary Cooper won an Academy Award for embodying York's character. More importantly for Alvin York, the film's success brought attention and financial support to the York Institute and other charitable efforts he backed. York was pleased that the movie emphasized his religious conversion and personal growth, although he remained humble about the battle scenes, knowing that real war was far uglier. When World War II broke out, the middle-aged Alvin York tried once again to serve his country. He volunteered for the army, offering to raise and lead troops, but at 54 years old and suffering from health issues, including arthritis, he was not fit for active duty. Instead, the U.S. Army made him a major, honorary, and sent him on tours to training camps and war bond rallies. York donned a uniform again to help inspire a new generation of soldiers, often telling them that bravery without righteousness meant nothing, and that he prayed no one would ever have to endure war as he had. The soldiers listened, knowing the legend who stood before them had truly been there and done that. After the wars, Alvin York lived a quiet life back in Tennessee. In York's own words perhaps best sum up his perspective. He said he was just one of many, and that any of the other boys could have done the same thing if fate had put them in his place that day. It was never about personal glory for him. It was about duty, faith, and doing what was right in the worst of circumstances. From a peaceful mountaineer who didn't want to fight, to a soldier who single-handedly halted a massacre and forced a whole enemy unit to surrender, Alvin York's journey was extraordinary. His life reminds us that sometimes the most reluctant of warriors can become the bravest of heroes, and that courage, guided by conscience and humility, can shine even in humanity's darkest hour.